Hello everyone, welcome to Texture Myth. In this session, we are going to discuss in a very detailed manner how actually API works in real world scenarios. Because in last session, we just talked about API, we understand what is API, and we also relate it with some example in a very layman terminology, right? But we all know that at the end we have to use this API with a technical system. So it is very important for us to understand the things in a very technical terms, like how actually API works. Okay, but don't worry, we will discuss each and everything in a very simple terminology, and I'll explain you throughout process like how in backend everything performed, what all kind of operation are performed when we are using the API. Okay, so at the end of this session you will be able to understand how API works in terms of Angular. But before we proceed further with this session, I would like to recommend you to please go and check out the previously released session first, because they all are in proper sequence and sync. So if you follow it sequentially, then it would be much more easier for you to understand the ongoing topic, because for time being we are just mainly focusing on how API works. Okay, but prior to that you should know what is API, how we can relate it with real world examples. Like in last session we talked about the restaurant example, right? So that you can refer. And to make the things easier for you, I have already attached the Texture Myth digital course book in the description box. There you will find more than 3,500 plus sessions available in both Hindi as well as English language. So as per your language preferences, you can consume the content, and if you have any queries related to the content, you can simply discuss it with the comments. Okay, alright, so now let's get started. Here you can see first very important question is how actually API works. So here I have noted down the detailed understanding in a very simple way so that you can easily relate it with your own application. Okay, so let's go one by one. The first thing is, whenever a user interact with an application like opening a page or clicking a button, the front end, that is Angular, may need a data from a server. Now firstly try to understand why API actually need. What is the need of API, right? So suppose you have created one application, Angular application, and on that application, on that website, you have provided one button to fetch the weather report, for example. Okay, now we all know that Angular itself does not store any kind of data. This is just a front end or UI part. So in this situation, if user click on that button, fetch the data, weather data, so how Angular will provide that data, because it doesn't have any access to the data, right? So in this situation, Angular will use a API, and that API will process your request and get response from the another system that is providing the weather report or weather information. So in this throughout overall process, you can see that Angular don't have any data, and to access that data, to access that weather report, it will use API. Okay, so same thing I have noted down here on line number 15, that says the frontend cannot directly communicate with a database or a server logic, so it sends a request through an API. Okay, so I think with this explanation it is very quite clear that why do we need API when we are working with Angular application, because in Angular application, Angular does not contain any data itself. Instead of that, it requests the data from another server with the help of API. Okay, so I think this part is clear. Now let's try to understand the same thing in a step-by-step flow, like how it works. So first thing is, user performs an action. Suppose user opens a page or click on button for product page or for weather report, anything. Okay, so in this situation, Angular application sends a request to the API. Okay, so if you let's take the same example of weather report. So user clicked on that weather report button, that get weather report. There is one button with this name. When user click on it, it then Angular application sends a request to the API, that is an application programming interface, and then API receives the request and forward it to the backend server. Okay, so now API, like after receiving the request, API process or forward this request to the backend server. After that, server process the request, fetches the data from the database and perform the logic. So in the server side, all the processes will be performed, like fetching the data from the database for the weather report as per our conditions, whatever condition we have specified, and perform the required validation or performance logic. After that, server sends the request back to the API. So whatever information it fetches from the database or by performing the logic will be considered as a response, and that response will be fed back to the API. Okay, so API simply sends the response back to the API server. Server sends the response back to the API, and then API returns that response to the Angular application again. Okay, so whatever information we have got through the server, that is in now API hand, and that API will provide that required information to the Angular application, and then later Angular receives it, the data, and updates it to the UI, and then Angular will show those weather report or weather details to the UI for the customer. Okay, so you can see overall there are 7 steps that are performed on the backend when user click on the button, but don't think it will take time. These all steps will be performed within a few seconds, even a fraction of second. Okay, that's why like whenever we interact with any application, doesn't matter which application you are using, everywhere like we are utilizing API. Okay, until or unless it is a very static site, we are utilizing API that help us to grab the information from other application. Okay, so in this situation you can see there is no need to understand how weather application works internally, because we don't that kind of information. We are looking only for the data, and we got the data as per our request. Okay, so these are the all 7 steps that performed on the backend, and trust me, it will not take that much of time as much we have these steps. Okay, now let's focus on the important point. So API, there are some important point I just mentioned here, like API acts as a middle layer between front-end and backend. It ensures security and structure. Yes, that is very important, because if you are communicating with 2 different systems, and there you want to make sure that whatever information you are passing from one place, from one application to another application, it should be secured, right? Otherwise no one prefer to go with the API if it is not secure and structured. And that is why we can say that yes, API ensures security and structure, and front end never directly access the database. That is also one way you can say that yes, Angular does not directly communicate with any database. Instead of that, it uses API to get the response or to get the required response. Okay, so I think this part is clear to all of you, like how actually API works and how API actually interact with other application. Now you can easily relate these all steps with the example which we took in last session when we talked about what is API. At that time we took one example related to restaurant, right? So now you can easily relate that yes, if API is moving from one place to another, it can be considered as a waiter who is and customer is Angular application who needs some food, and server is a kitchen, and we have the food served as a response. And documentation part, you can before executing any API you need menu, right, to order the dish. So in that case you can relate it with the API or documentation. Clear? So yeah, these are the all things that will help you to understand in a better way what does API, how it works. In last session we talked about this thing in a very simple terms, and now we talked about in terms of technical, because at the end you have to use it in a technical ways. Okay, and after discussing few more prerequisites, we will move to the practical examples where we will perform all these operation by our own with full examples. Clear? So yeah, that's all for today. See you in the next session with new topics. So thank you for watching Tech Share.